Speak now or hold your. All right. Thank you, Sage. So welcome, everyone. I am Andy Norman, and this is Examined Lives, a forum for exploring life's big questions in a collaborative, somewhat philosophical way, but also informed by the evolutionary sciences. I should say that I believe Examined Lives is now, this is approximately our first birthday. We've been around for 12 months now. So congratulations to all of those who've stayed with us all that time. I think we're off to a flying start here. I'm loving the sense of community we're building, and I hope you'll stay with us and help us grow this into something great. So our topic today is lies and deception. This is the first topic that was suggested from the floor, and I'm going to shout out to Steve for suggesting it. It won going away in our vote for topic last month. Quick reminder that our approach is to, we want a conversation with lots of turn taking, lots of short, bright, shiny observations that give people many chances to contribute. Think of it as a shared attempt to assemble a jigsaw puzzle. So no long monologues, please. If you can, make your point in a minute or less. I get one exemption from that here, and that's to introduce the topic, but won't need much more than a minute to do it. Let's start with a fact. Human beings deceive. In fact, we seem to traffic quite freely in deception. And this raises a bunch of fascinating questions, among them, why? Why do we do this? Especially given that it often damages our relationships. How common is deception? What forms do our deceptions take? Are some of them ethically permissible, or are all forms of deception bad? Is our capacity or tendency to deceive inborn or learned? Certainly seems as though we have inherited from our ancestors an awareness that other people have minds, and that our well-being depends on the contents of other people's minds. And this naturally, I think, suggests to many of us ways to advantage ourselves through deception, which is, I think, part of the answer to the question of why we do it. So can lying and deceiving become habitual? And what happens when deception becomes normalized? These are the questions I encourage us to explore. I imagine you have some of your own. Feel free to throw those into the mix. I'll just mention here before we get started, the Douglas Rothkopf article, which I think got Steve thinking about this originally. It's a really provocative piece, and there was a link to it in the invitation. You weren't expected to read that, but can I see a show of hands? Does anybody have a chance to take a look at it? A few, good. Well, I'll ask you guys to help me channel some of the more provocative claims that Rothkopf raises, because I think there'll be a nice stimulus to conversation. Here's a very brief summary of what I took away from Rothkopf. He argues that lying is endemic in American society, that we lie to each other constantly, that it's baked into our culture, that we both lie and tolerate deception on many, many different levels. He claims that the core institutions of our society are massive lie delivery systems. Yeah, including nations, religions, schools, Hollywood, the media, social media. All of these are systems that basically accustom us to untruth, according to Rothkopf. Okay, enough of me introducing the subject. I'd love to hear from you. Again, you can use the, you can raise your hand under the reactions button down at the bottom of your screen. And if you do that, hang on. If you do that, I will know that you have something you'd like to share, and recognize you. So what do y'all think about lies and deception? Alan, kick us off, start us off.
Well, I think one of the most interesting and serious aspects of this is mutual deception. We are a storytelling animal. We like to share stories with one another, and we can get caught up in a mutual deception, if you wish to call it that.
Nice. And our, well, fictional stories would certainly seem to be in a kind of an example of mutual escapism, if not mutual deception. Something like that, right? When you inhabit a fictional world by reading somebody's story or inhabiting someone else's story. That's an interesting phenomenon.
Due to that, many years ago, when I was probably about 10, when I came to the conclusion that God was being created, rather like we add amazing achievements to our fictional heroes in the comics that I was reading.
Mm-hmm. I hear omnipotence is a pretty impressive superpower.
Yes.
Kathleen.
Well, what you said about mutual deception and the nations, I'm sorry, but I'm just thinking of a family situation in which, I won't go into detail, my parents thought they were doing me a favor by swapping out our old ugly piano for a brand new one that I hated. But I knew that they were so poor that it was a huge sacrifice that they made, not realizing they had made a terrible mistake. And I was 13 and old enough to realize this. So I pretended to love it. And I don't know if my parents were deceiving themselves into thinking they had done a good thing, or if they knew that I needed a better piano than that, but they couldn't afford it. So I guess what I'm seeing here is, like what you were saying, our well-being depends on the contents of others' minds. I knew my role was to keep the family dynamics okay. And that's because I had a bad sister who would have screamed and thrown a tantrum. And I kind of like, okay, only one of us can do that, or my parents will have too much to deal with. So I guess what I'm getting at is that I just read a book by Jennifer Freyd on institutional betrayal, and I see relationships between the lying of institutions and the dynamics of families. And maybe that was a bigger piece of the puzzle than I should have given, but I'll stop there.
Not at all. That's a wonderful contribution and a wonderful example of how pretending can actually be probably the right thing to do, right? Being a gracious and person who smooths things over within the family when your parents make a sacrifice like that. That seems to me like the right thing to do. It's a nice example of less than complete honesty possibly being the proper course. Nice, thanks for sharing that. Hank. Do need you to unmute, Hank.
Hello? Oh, hi. Hi, nice to see you all again. This is also on a personal level. When I was reading the article the other day, I wasn't feeling too well. It was the first time I had sort of like a dizziness and stuff. And so I'm still reacting, I'm still coming off and I'm okay. But I was a little more raw than usual. So I was so overwhelmed. I mean, I'm not overwhelmed where I lost touch with reality, but I was so raw to his, I guess he was using, from my point of view, his absurdity to make a point, like the genius of the absurd. But in that rawness, I have this feeling like, oh my gosh, is there anybody, it's like, what am I surrounded by? And I'm not being paranoid, like I'm not concerned my wife or my friends are being that way necessarily. But I felt very raw, and I've been reading a little more stuff, that you suggested. I've been reading something on Thomas More's Utopia, some review on it. And it's like, I go, oh my God, what is all this sort of inquiry and rational thinking? I'm only getting more upset. Now, this doesn't usually happen to me. but it is the last couple of days. So I just want to bring in that raw side of my humanity to here as well.
All right. Thank you, Hank.
And then one concept, the neurobiology of subjectivity. And that's the part about each one of us, you know, the way that most people have discovered the brain operates, we all have our own view of the world based upon the model building, you know, Eric Hawkins and all that. So I just want to bring that in here. So what happens to this this subject? Whoops, excuse me. It's just my dog.
Okay, thank you, Hank.
All right, good.
I'm going to let Alex jump in here.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Hank. Alex.
I think an important place to look at here is the intersection between lies and logic. I think lies are, in a big sense, the act of interfering with someone else's logic, but they are also oftentimes the result of our own logic. And we are logically concluding that the best decision is to lie. And in that sense, I think lies can breed other lies, because lies are born from logic and lies corrupt the logic of others. So I think, going back to your question, can lies become habitual? I think not only can they become habitual in a person, they can become habitual in a relationship and in a society, because they cause others to believe they cause others' logic to come to the conclusion that lies are a way to get to where they need to be.
Interesting. I love that observation. Very nice. Thank you, Alex. Kathleen, I don't know if your hand is up again or still up. Okay, how about Steve then?
I think an important distinction to make is between deliberate and non-deliberate deception. One of the books one of the readings that you listed in the email about this meeting was Robert Trivers' book on self-deception, The Folly of Fools. And I just finished it about half an hour ago. I highly commend it to you, but I will say that it's not for the faint-hearted, because when you read it, you will forever need to forego any hope that you see yourself realistically. It's an enjoyable read. I mean, Trivers is brilliant, obviously, a little curmudgeonly, which makes it fun to read. But it's really a really very good book. But one of the things that is a cornerstone of his theory of self-deception is that we deceive ourselves in order to better deceive others. If I want to convince Andy of a lie, the best way for me to do that is for me to believe the lie that I'm telling Andy. And just as one example of that, it reminded me of something that Robert Wright wrote in The Moral Animal many, many years ago in talking about sexual relations. Many women sometimes lament that a man will tell her he loves her in order to have or to facilitate having sex with her. And then shortly after sex happens, the man decides he's no longer in love and the relationship is short-lived. What Robert Wright says, and it fits well with Trivers' theory, is that it's entirely possible that that's not Machiavellian, deliberate, conscious deception by the male, but that evolution has shaped men to experience that emotion, to mistake lust for love, and that it's an honest profession that a man makes at the time. Just one example of how self-deception can play itself out. And one last comment about Alan's comment about mutual deception. I think that much mutual deception is non-deliberate, unconscious self-deception, both parties engaging in self-deception without either being aware of it.
Interesting. And one of the things I really like about Steve's contribution here is that it's suggesting that we start to make distinctions between different types of deception, different kinds of lies. So deliberate and non-deliberate was his first cut at it. But I do think as much as I admire Rothkopf's provocative essay and its tendency to get us to rethink our habitual dishonesty, despite that, I think that he can reasonably be charged with lumping a whole lot of things under the term lying that might best be treated with a more complex set of concepts.
Mhm.
So self-deception is not like manipulative or Machiavellian lying. We tell ourselves fictions, and a lot of times we kind of know, for the most part, that they're not real, but we can still slip into a fictional narrative and inhabit that world in a way that fools part of the mind some of the time. We engage in pretenses of various kinds. Kathleen's story was nice because she basically pretended to like the new piano. Is that a deliberate lie? Well, arguably there's some important relevant difference here. She was, I guess, engaging in some form of pretense. I think pretending was her word. And perhaps there are important differences between that kind of deception and other kinds. So it's not clear to me that we should lump all forms of deception under one big heading, lie, and then just treat and imagine that we've described a unitary phenomenon. Love to hear from some folks who haven't spoken yet, but I'm going to take Alan here since he's ready to go.
I think it's a song from Showboat, Why Don't We Pretend? Pretension is, in a sense, lying, but it's manufacturing a play that we want to join in together.
Hey, Alan, to what extent would you call religion that kind of play acting? I hope I'm not offending anyone's sensibilities here, but it does seem to me that I've been tempted to characterize certain forms of religious enthusiasm as kind of a giant game of let's pretend, where a whole bunch of people buy in and seem to benefit or think they benefit from the collective pretense.
I think I'll be very careful here. It's something that we naturally look for, to generate a shared pretense, if you can call it that. I don't know whether anyone here has come across the philosophy of as if by Weihinger, turn of the century, last century, where we're constantly generating stories, if you can call them stories. Much of science is stories that we can manipulate in our minds, but we can't necessarily transfer that manipulation to fact, though fortunately we often can. Mm-hmm. So we're constantly, so when the issue is, do we know what reality is? The answer is no. We just keep on generating more and more accounts that seem to do the job for us.
Very good. Diane, I'd love to hear from you.
Actually, I was going to mention something rather close to what you asked. What about conventionally accepted fictions? Things like money, which doesn't have any intrinsic value, but we behave very much as if it has lots. And that would fit in, I think, with your question about religion, because there are, depending on which religion that any you adhere to, all of the others at least are full of conventionally accepted fictions.
Yeah.
But are these deceptions? I think they are, because people do believe it.
Mm-hmm. So let's take the case of money for a second here. Is money a lie? Is money a deception? Is money a shared pretense? Some of you, we've talked a little bit about Yuval Harari's book Sapiens in here.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about a number of things like money and laws and contracts and rights as just collective fictions. So it's not as though rights exist in any material form, but if we all pretend that we have rights, then things tend to work out better for all of us. So are human rights just a fiction, just a pretense? And are you comfortable saying that? Kathleen doesn't appear to be quite ready to go there. Neither am I. Elizabeth, talk to me.
My question is really a follow-up to what Alan was starting to say, and I could actually use a little bit more clarification, but he mentioned that kind of the as if, and I'm remembering that during the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel and that group of artists and writers, their movement was, I thought, based in as if that was central to what they were doing, and they were taking the Czech government signing, I think, the Helsinki Accords for human rights, and then sort of acting as if that was meant, even though everything that was happening in the country was counter to that. I'm wondering if you know anything about that, and they kind of actually sort of put on display the big lie.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, they use their own form of sort of collective imagination or ability to treat as if to overturn another collective lie?
Well, yeah, they were saying, and this is where I need some clarification, because this is a long time ago, but I remember that they were sort of doing in the spirit of almost merry pranksters by saying, they were all getting thrown in prison and put on trial. And they started this movement, I thought, that was based on this as if kind of idea. And we're going to act as if what the Czech government is saying, that they respect human rights and the rights of artists in free speech. And they just sort of put it on full display and acted as if that's were true. And what it did is it sort of amplified or brought into clear relief the disconnect or dissonance between them.
Fascinating. It would be wonderful if humanity came to a collective realization that treating a tyrant as if he has no power would actually deprive him of power, right? If we all did that.
Yeah, I've thought about that. Like just if a giant crowd had shown up in front of the White House the last 4 years and just yawned, like we're not, just not, we're bored. This is,
I hear you. Hank.
Yeah, I was thinking about, let's think about the, pro-social movement and the pro-social world. And then you have competition about what is the best pro-social world. And then we have I have a hypothesis, but maybe that hypothesis, if I'm going to say, this is my hypothesis, let's get together and let's get all the researchers together and let's try to confirm some of my hypothesis. But most people come out with it less like the scientists, but more like, I like this pro-social world better. So there's this whole thing about, I don't know, I'm going to call it competition and survival. Back to the Darwinian notion of what do we need to, let's say, live in magical thinking or self-deceit? Well, according to Freud and some others, yes, it's just part of the course, but hopefully you grow out of it a little bit, maybe a little bit more, but you never go out of it. So the element of omnipotence and grandiosity and all the narratives and stories. So just another take on it. Yeah,
thank you. Good. Vivek?
I just want to add further on pro-sociality and especially about we have been coming across the debates about veganism and criticisms against Green Revolution. I had appealed to the criticisms against the Green Revolution 15 years back. I fell to the deceptions that is spread by the movements which are pro-nature and pro-nature is good, but being puritanical, pro-compassion or pro-nature is a little bit challenging. My learning through ecological sciences relieved me out of this deception. In ecological sciences, if I believe veganism could be a solution for industrial slaughterhouses, but in ecological sciences, you can't conserve grasslands without having cattle population grazing on the grasslands. So we need cattle population. We can't completely shift to the laboratory-based meat production. So I think this deception collapses the ecological system also. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you, Vivek. Alex?
I think an important piece here is that there are different levels on which things can exist. And I think while on some level, money may be a collective fiction, on the level of society, it is a truth. Similar to how in a conversation with you, Andy, we talked about how free will seems to exist on some levels, but not on others. I think some things can be lies or at least fictions on certain levels that we can think about. But when we think about them in the context of this collective we have created of humans, this collective society, they become real and they become true.
Yeah.
Things like rights don't really exist when you are thinking about purely material and when you are thinking about like the level of cells and molecules. But when you think about society, it is clear that there are these things which we owe to one another.
Beautifully put, and that helps me. I want to rescue rights. It does not seem to me that rights should be treated the same as like witches and demons and other fictions, right? We were right to banish witches and demons from our ontologies, but it's not at all clear to me that banishing rights from our ontologies would be a good idea. So you've given me a nice way to think about that, Alex. Thank you. Steve.
This is not a direct answer to the question you raised, but it's something I thought was worth sharing, since this we're supposed to be looking at this through sort of the lens of evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology. And one of the things that came across for me in the readings that I hadn't really thought about before was that cooperation and deception have essentially co-evolved.
Yeah.
And that there are, when you have cooperation, that creates selection pressures for lying, because lying means you can have your needs met at a lower cost. And one of the critiques I think that can be made of some of the research and evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology to date is that it's neglected that aspect of, if you will, the yin and yang of cooperation and deception. And not only did cooperation create selection pressures for lying, one of the articles we read also made the point that it may well have been lying that led to some of our more advanced cognitive functions, such as the theory of mind. To lie well, you have to have a theory of mind. So I think that an area of neglect in evolutionary psychology and research has been the co-evolution of deception and cooperation. And I realize I've veered us off into a slightly different direction, but I thought that was again, given the focus of our conversation through evolution, I thought that was worth sharing.
Very much worth sharing, I think. And it seems to me that one way to explain how cooperation sets the stage for deception is that when cooperation creates an expectation of trust, when deception deception is often taking advantage of somebody else's trust. And if cooperation creates a world where many people trust each other, they're also creating the conditions on which deceivers can begin to succeed at what they do. Nice. Diane?
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the challenge you threw out about rescuing rights. I don't think that that's a deception, at least not like angels and devils or even money. I think there's if you take cooperation as the sort of sine qua non of human life,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's a reasonable thing to do, then for it to work, there are going to have to be some basic rights. Now, I think there are some complications, because if you're in different kinds of relationships, what you have a right to expect or to be or whatever might be different than in some other kinds of relationships.
Mm.
And so this is more a philosophical problem than it is an evolutionary problem, but it seems to also be evolutionary. What kinds of rights do there have to be for the system to work?
Mm-hmm.
If people don't have certain rights, eventually there's going to be a breakdown.
Mm-hmm. And that's an argument for why believing in rights is useful.
Yes.
And whether that is also an argument for why to believe that it's true that we have rights is somehow that seems like a slightly different question. Maybe I shouldn't.
But yeah, but the question is, what do you mean by true? Because
fair enough.
If what makes it true is the fact that it works,
yeah,
then
so I've come across something in the evolutionary literature called frequency dependent selection. So, and I may not explain this adequately, so I'll invite people who understand it better than I do to weigh in. But imagine when you have a complex population, some of the members of whom are highly cooperative, and others are, you create an environment where others can actually carve a niche for themselves by being exploitative. So imagine a society composed entirely of completely trusting, Dawkins's word for this, suggestive word for this is suckers. Imagine an entire society of just utterly trusting suckers. You get a cheat entering this population, and they do extremely well by taking advantage of all of the unconditional trust that's all around them. And so you can imagine the cheats starting to wipe out the suckers. And Dawkins has a nice little thought experiment where this happens in populations of birds. And then he imagines a third type of bird evolving, and rather than just cooperate unconditionally or exploiting unconditionally, this third type he calls a grudger will cooperate if you cooperate with it, but will begrudge you if you try to cheat or exploit it. And this more conditional strategy, one that is basically says, if you're friendly to me, I'll be friendly to you, but if you're mean to me, I'm going to be mean to you. That more discriminating strategy turns out in mathematical models to do quite well in populations composed of many cheats. So a kind of a reciprocal, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, behavioral strategy can spread through a population of otherwise exploitative critters because it forms friendships which are highly adaptive. That made some sense.
They call it.
Say again?
coalitions is what they
Coalitions.
evolution.
Right. Kathleen.
Sorry. Here's the problem I always have with that is that, okay, that makes sense on an individual basis, but when you get into human societies where hierarchies formed so that certain groups, in order to be understood as cooperative, end up having to give more than other groups. I just want to throw that out there, that is where, you know, the idea of, are you cooperating, can have a nice sound to it, but it can also have a really ugly sound. Like, you're not cooperating because you're sticking up for your rights when actually you don't have the status or the gender identity to do that.
So it's even possible to use the language of cooperation and rights to guilt trip people into maybe acting against their own interests.
Or gaslight them or bully them.
Gaslight them. Interesting. Very nice. Hank, you've been patient. I'm sorry, I missed your hand there for a minute.
I want to think of, as we're talking, there's so much to respond to, but deception and context. Okay, so here's a thought experiment. Just imagine, we all here, we're operating in a certain context, sort of cooperative thinkers and critical thinkers. But as a psychotherapist, I often ask my clients, is there anything or are there things you don't want to tell me? And that's quite provocative. And, you know, you get different things from different people. But then the question is, are there things that you don't want to tell yourself? You know, we could call it whatever nomenclature, whatever, you know, whatever view of it, but that goes on the individual level. So we're talking at different levels of abstraction. So in here, I'm not asking anybody to do it, but I imagine in this context, there are certain things that people don't want to tell this group as a whole, certain things about themselves. Now, it's appropriate. Like, I don't want to know your bathroom habits today, but why not? You know, because of context. But there are things that might be, I don't know, somebody might say, I'm too tall or I'm too short. I don't want people to know it because we're all sitting. I'm just making these things up. Now, are these things on an individual level? Are they deceit?
Interesting.
They're contextual. So moving from the larger level, which to me is a little more complex, to the individual level, and for each one of us to do these kind of thought experiments about this deceit, separate from all our, you know, knowledge bases. So that's another way of thinking of it.
Yeah, thank you, Hank. Vivek.
Yeah. And you just now you added about this cooperation and conditional strategies in other organisms. My research experience in bumblebees, where in bumblebees, researchers have already both empirically and through simulations, they have proved that out of the bumblebee communities, if there are 15 species in the bumblebee community, only 2 species is contributing more than 90% of the pollination services. So the researchers came up with the question, so does that mean biodiversity conservation is useless? So the pro-social argument of conserving even the rare and endangered species is going to be useless. The interesting thing about this, only 2 species or 3 species of bumblebees contributing 90% of the pollination service is, among those 2 or 3 species, the highest population species is robber species. They rob the honey without even giving the pollination service. Even after robbing, they are giving more pollination services, mainly because of high demography, more number of bumblebees. So this is an interesting paradox, and that left a bigger question in ecological sciences and biodiversity conservation debate about whether pro-sociality is the only argument for biodiversity conservation.
Interesting.
Which we could, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Vivek. That's fascinating. And it's interesting to see these same dynamics of cooperation versus exploitative strategies playing out in very different species, right? And oftentimes populations support subpopulations with different behavioral strategies that each adjust the fitness levels of the other strategies, so that sometimes an equilibrium is formed and sometimes those equilibria are disrupted. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I'm responding to what Hank started to note about, like, what happens, say, in a therapeutic context with his clients, and what is said or not said. And two things came to mind. One was a friend of mine who's been in therapy for decades, and I'm like, well, what are you talking about now? And she said, I just show up and ask myself, what am I ashamed of? And how I start or prompt myself. And I thought, wow, that's rich. And then the other thing I was thinking about is James Gilligan's work. I don't know if anybody knows his work. His wife is Carol Gilligan, who's done work, on the moral development in women. He is a psychiatrist at Harvard who, for decades, oversaw a prison. He was the psychiatric director at a prison for the criminally insane, and he wrote a book called Violence. It's a really, really insightful book. But one of the things he talked about was, he said, for women, their greatest fear is sexual or physical violence. And that's why me and almost every woman I know puts her keys between her hands when she's going into the parking garage to get her car. And for men, he said, and this came from his work, is for men, their greatest fear is feeling shame. And even worse than feeling shame is the shame over feeling shame. And that's why the smallest perceived slight can lead to the most explosive violence. So, and then I start thinking about, even in a collective sense, why genocides, for instance, are not acknowledged. And so basically, what's the connection between our resistance to experiencing shame or vulnerability and deception and lies?
And I forget who, perhaps it was implicit in Kathleen's comment before. So my guess is we can all think of instances like Kathleen's where we indulged in a minor form of deception or dishonesty. So just pretending to be delighted by a gift that you really don't like. Somebody gives you a gift at your birthday, and it's god-awful gift and you wouldn't want it in 100 years, but you pretend to like it for the sake of the relationship. We all do that kind of thing, right? And it's not hard to imagine that our societies need that kind of dishonesty to maintain themselves. And yet I'm also drawn to the Rothkopf's premise that we indulge so much dishonesty in our culture now that we basically should not be surprised that the big election lie of Donald Trump is gaining huge traction. We essentially raise so many young people to believe in tooth fairies and Easter bunnies and immortality and souls and afterlife. And you give kids a steady enough diet of these things, then they're going to believe demagogues when they come along. I think you can read Rothkopf's article as a plea for a radically more honest world, which makes me want to write children's books that expose the tooth fairy as a myth. In fact, I'm working on a kid's book like that right now. David.
Yeah, I'd just like to piggyback really quick off of a very brief comment in terms of framing off of what Diane and Kathleen were saying. I think maybe one way to frame this is thinking about, from an evolutionary perspective, is thinking about how many of these mechanisms evolved face to face, right? These game theory mechanisms of, okay, we keep a ledger of positive and negative transactions with individuals. This is a face-to-face phenomena. And what we might be seeing is that when you take it from the face-to-face level, i.e. the camp and band level that we evolved in for 1.8 million years, and then you go beyond that threshold of face-to-face, you see a lot of these cascade failure systems because of this state of evolutionary mismatch. And that's maybe why things are going haywire once you get beyond that face-to-face level.
David, I can't help but wonder if you're thinking of the internet and social media in particular. I certainly am prompted to think of that, but even the written word allows somebody to write down ideas at one point in time and somebody else on the other side of the planet, maybe centuries later, to read those worlds, which is an alternative. It's an additional channel other than face-to-face communication. And there was probably disruption caused by the information technology of the written word, just as there is huge disruption with the internet today. Fascinating observation, David, thank you. Vedant?
Yeah, so now coming back to the concept of money, if we are looking at it, it seems it is very much more complex phenomena at social level than just seeing it as a fiction or a deception. Because so the question is, what is there some at social level? Is there some coevolution between deception, lies, and abstraction? And because money is not just, it seems to be a lie, it is also abstract concept because of which equated to multiple resources, and because of which we could go to the higher level of social organization, which you can see what happens in European Union when it is united, they equate the currency.
I actually love that suggestion, Vedant. A question like that occurred to me after the recent financial collapse, and when remember when the bankers were inventing these very abstract instruments called credit default swaps and mortgage-backed securities or whatever, these highly abstract entities, which were essentially conjured into existence by, I don't know, contracts or financial institutions of one kind or another. Some of them proved highly unstable, and we suffered a huge economic setback as a result of some people finding ways to exploit those highly abstract and arguably fictional entities. Steve.
I want to put in a word in defense of the tooth fairy, Andy, and Santa Claus and other things like that. One of the more influential books I read as a parent many, many years ago was Bruno Bettelheim's book called The Uses of Enchantment. And he talks about the unconscious psychological needs that things like Santa Claus as an idealized parent who gives and asks for nothing in return, things of that nature. So, but just to go off from there, I think it's interesting to think about children and lying. Not only how parents lie to children, but that children lie at a very, very young age. I recall when my wife was pregnant with our second child, our firstborn, who was 3 at the time. We caught him in some transgression or another, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but his self-defense at age 3 was that the baby had come out of mommy's tummy and done it and then gone back in. Which for a 3-year-old, I mean, that was a good defensive lie, he thought. So I think what happens over the course of our lifetime is that we just get better at it. We start lying very young and we just get better at it, including lying to ourselves.
Interesting. I wonder if I'm actually grateful for the pushback and defense of the tooth fairy here. If we grant Bettelheim's premise that enchantment is an important part of a healthy childhood, I guess that for me raises the question of whether we can have enchantment without intentional deception. So when I enjoy a piece of fiction, I can be enchanted by that fiction without ever being deceived in it. Right. I know that that's a one-off. I know it's a fictional world. I can inhabit that world for fun, but
Yeah.
when push comes to shove, I can step outside it.
The distinction between reality and fantasy for children is not there yet, the way it is for an adult.
Fair enough. And it might be a good idea to help kids start teasing those apart younger, just because we get so good at lying later on. This is a point that would be really fun to explore in more detail, Steve, and it's coming up right at the end of the hour. I'm going to give Diane a last word here, and then we're going to pick a topic for next month. Diane?
Okay, I want to go back to the big lie and put it in an evolutionary context rather than a learning context, because I think it basically functions as costly signaling. It's not that people actually believe it. It's something they need to believe in order to prove who they are.
I think that's a wonderful observation. I recently came across a paper, which I forget the author of, who basically said a lot of the falsehood indulged in and tolerated on the Trumpian right in America is essentially just coalitional signaling. They don't care that it's not true. They're signaling their loyalty and reaffirming their identity, and that
Being not true is even more useful.
Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you for bringing that up. I'm surprised that wasn't mentioned earlier in this. Excellent observation. Thank you. Okay. I think we have one or two newcomers this time. If you're not familiar, we collectively choose the topic for the following month right here at the end of the hour. I'm going to suggest 3 topics, describe each one briefly, take maybe one candidate topic from the floor if anybody has one they'd like to suggest, and then we'll collectively vote, and the top vote getter will be our topic for next month. Okay, so just listen to them through and decide which of these, if any. You can vote for as many as you like. Topic number 1, what is life anyway? How would you define life? What makes life what it is? Second topic, climate change and despair. How do you grapple with the facts of climate change and not despair? What strategies can we share among us for maintaining our mental health and our optimism in the face of climate change? Is climate change responsible for the epidemic of anxiety and depression among young people today? And if so, how can we help them? I would certainly appreciate some strategies for helping me deal with the reality of this in a way that keeps me hopeful. Third topic, extraterrestrial life. What do we know about extraterrestrial life and its possibilities? How does one think through the likelihood of such life? And what do I think there's a branch of astronomy now where or cosmologists and astronomers who actually think about the prospects of finding life on other planets. So it'd be interesting to share what we've collectively gleaned on that topic. Okay, those are my 3 suggestions. Do we have a 4th topic proposal that anybody would like to discuss? Yes, Hank.
Is it possible to limit the transmission over generations of, let's say, folk wisdom and folk science?
So I want to give that a nice succinct. It's so implicit in that is the idea that folk wisdom can be an obstacle to progress, and so how would we?
Yeah,
Yeah.
when it's an well, yeah, we could say, is folk wisdom always an obstacle to progress, or only sometimes, or most of the time, or never?
Okay. How
either
about
way.
we'll just call that the folk wisdom. What we can talk about folk wisdom as a phenomenon and the problems it raises,
Yes.
and explore that whole space. Okay,
Right.
folk wisdom is topic number 4. Okay, take a minute to decide, a second to decide which of these you'd like to vote for. I recommend voting for 1, 2, or 3 of them, since voting for 0 or 4 effectively renders your votes useless. Okay, please use the, let's see, what is it? The reactions window and the raise hand to signal your approval for a given topic. And again, you can vote for as many as you like. Okay, who would like to discuss the nature of life? What is life anyway? And Sage, you're busy doing a tally for me. Okay. Thank you all. Hands down, please. Second topic, climate change and despair. Wow, okay. Okay, thank you all. Hands down. Third topic, extraterrestrial life. Those of you interested in this, you can all see, I think, that that one's not going to win out this time around. If anyone can think of a way to tweak that topic description so as to it can rise to the top in a future round of voting, that please help me with that. And that would be great. Okay, finally, hands down. And finally, folk wisdom. What is it? What effects does it have on our prospects? How do we deal with it, etc.? Ooh, Hank, you've come up with a popular one here. All right. So Sage, thank you all. Hands down. Sage, am I right in thinking the climate change and despair was our top vote getter?
Yep, by 2 votes.
Okay. All right. Well, you guys are just a cheerful bunch, aren't you, choosing that topic? I guess I should take responsibility for having proposed it. Well, at the very least, we'll help each other deal with it. In the meantime, stay hopeful. It's good to hear, good to see you all, and thanks for coming back to Examined Lives, and we hope to see you again next month. Oh, put this down on your calendar, please. Thursday, September 16th at 12 o'clock Eastern.